Now we're going to get into women-owned businesses. We can do it. Yes, they can. Let's look at some of the numbers. All right, first up here, I can let you know that women-owned businesses in the U.S. from a little bit ago in 2012, there were over 9 million, almost 10, an increase of about 27% from 2007. Hopefully those numbers continue to rise when we'll see the numbers at the end of this year. But among these firms, 89.5 have no employees other than the owner. That's right, sole proprietorship. These are women doing it for themselves, literally. But those 10.5% of remaining businesses that aren't single person run are employing over 8 million Americans. That's a big number, and that's in addition to the ones who are just single owner operators. So moving on now, the highest number of women-owned business firms in the U.S. in 2012. We've got a breakdown. So administrative and support services, including waste management and remediation services, employed about 1.1 million sole proprietor businesses. Healthcare and social assistance had about 1.6 million businesses that were headed up by women. Retail made about 1 million jobs for women-owned businesses, and other services all along the spectrum had about 1.9 million businesses headed by women, of course. Final slide here, I'm going to let you know that women-owned businesses in New York City as of 2015, some good numbers here we can definitely improve on, about 376,000 women-owned businesses, constituting about 40% of all privately held companies in our city. But 91% of them, again, much like the national trend, have no employees other than those women who are out there doing it for themselves. But we can let you know that Brooklyn has a very good honor of being the home of the most women-owned businesses with about 28.6%. In Staten Island, you got to catch up. Only about 3% of businesses that are women-owned are in Staten Island. So overall, women are definitely doing it for themselves, and we're going to find out how they can get even better when we get into the A block.
According to several reports, these economic pressures are challenging for women-owned businesses, as we just saw, including access to capital, education and resources, child care, and consumer spending. To help us understand the struggle and what can be done to breach the many gaps, we want to welcome Sabrina Philson, president of Epsilon Strategy. So nice to have you here.
Thank you.
And Maria Otero, founder and president of the Women's Venture Fund.
Hi.
Okay. Well, business seems to definitely be booming. So kudos to the women and business owners. Maria, can you tell us why capital funding doesn't seem to be keeping up?
Well, there are a couple of reasons, but the traditional reasons that bankers look at are the size of the loan and the credit history of the applicant. And so women don't have the same credit history of a traditional entrepreneur. They don't have the assets, they don't have the collateral typically, and more importantly, they're generally very financially conservative, and so they're asking for small loans. So if the typical loan that they're asking for is significantly less than $100,000, there are very few banks that are ever interested in that size loan. So women go to alternative lenders. Sometimes they'll come to organizations like ours that focus on women and provide loans, but sometimes they'll go to very expensive alternative lenders and use their credit cards or use other kinds of less traditional financing options, and then they get themselves into bigger problems down the road.
So Sabrina, what don't those numbers tell us? We saw that a lot of women-owned businesses are the sort of sole proprietorship and they're out there grinding, we could only assume. But what can you not gauge from those numbers that is the reality for a lot of women, especially in New York, trying to make business?
Well, I think one thing that's very interesting to consider is that people often use non-traditional means to get their business done if they don't have typical infrastructure. Mm-hmm. You know, the old school kind of bartering system. You know, you may not see employees listed for some of these businesses, but people may exchange services.
Gotcha.
So people are creative in how they use limited resources to be able to stay alive and keep their business afloat.
Very cool. Now, it was announced on March 1st that after more than 20 years of effort, the federal government for the first time met its goal of awarding 5% of the money it spent on contractors to businesses owned by women.
A whole 5%. Congratulations. Thank you to half the population.
Is this a day late, dollar short? What would be a more lofty goal, or why does this take so long to do so little?
Well, it's a very cumbersome process and not suited for every business. And what that 5% doesn't speak to is contracts that are awarded to be able to make a number by an agency, whereas the applicant may not have the capacity to fulfill that number and winds up not keeping the contract. So I'm not sure how strong that 5% would be, but let's assume that it's close to that. They're really relying on a third party to get to their goals because they're putting a lot of pressure on the general contractor to make sure that they're bringing in minority vendors, and there's no support structure for those subcontractors. And so they're often in a position where they're taken advantage of. We see this time and time again where they have to carry expenses longer than they should because the general contractor isn't performing well or isn't treating them well. And they're first-time subcontractors, and they don't know how to negotiate a good deal. And so when they run into problems, they don't have relationships already with attorneys or others who could assist them, and they wind up getting into this vicious cycle where they might have done a really good job, but they have to repeat it 3 or 4 times because that contractor didn't really work with them well, and now they're eating that cost. And so who's really benefiting from that?
Well, it's like 20 years is a lot of pressure at the federal level, but a little bit closer to home, New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer got a lot of buzz when he released a report about minority and women-owned businesses in the city and how they were faring, and actually graded the city government agencies, and there were not a lot of high grades among the contracts for city government, but I know even a greater subset of that is minority women-owned businesses that are having a hard time.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things that came out of that study, and is a fact in particular, is that payment terms, and something Maria just mentioned, payment terms are often an issue when a contractor or subcontractor gets a piece of business, whether they're women or minority or other period. Right. Small businesses have a difficult time when they have to float expenses and aren't compensated in a reasonable amount of time. And I think that's one of the things that Stringer highlighted, is that there are now moves in place to actually get small companies to be paid in a quicker fashion. There are a lot of things that are of issue with, I think, that came about in the report that Stringer put out there. One of the things is, in particular, agencies aren't being held accountable. And so we have goals that the governor set forth, but no one who is there to say, here are the repercussions, right, of not meeting these goals. That's the importance of having advocacy groups that are out there, you know, pounding the pavement and raising the visibility to the fact that some agencies aren't making their numbers. Bertha Lewis at the Black Institute, you know, has put forth a couple of really fantastic studies that put real facts on the page, and as an alternative shows ways that the government can actually support growth in more women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses in getting a fair shake.
Right, and they can foster that without handing out anything. It's not any subsidy, it's just leveling a playing field.
Exactly.
Now, we're talking obviously about government contracts from federal to local and state. How does the private sector fare?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on the industry. I think in general, professional services are very challenged in how they're used by private and public sector. We tend to get pigeonholed in, you know, certain industries. For example, you know, a supplier of certain types of goods or event planning. They're tremendous lawyers and, you know, accountants and consultants like myself, and, you know, you can speak to that as well, I'm sure, who have the ability to deliver on non-traditional services, and you know, unfortunately, they don't get enough attention and utilization. So that's one of the things we should bring attention to.
Let's give them some attention. Maria, you're at the women's venture firm. Now, what are you happy to see cross your desk? What do you get excited about when you say, oh, wow, we didn't have one of those. Let's make this happen.
So we have seen more and more women, minority women, who are getting contracts as subcontractors, and now 1 or 2 of them as general contractors from the city. But it's in construction. A lot of the business that comes out of the city really is related to construction, and that's great. And we're able to help those businesses in particular because we have a unique underwriting process that we use for women to help them be able to manage their cash in a way that works with the way the city pays, which is not the most timeliest process. So we're happy about things like that. We're also happy to see that more and more women are looking into being more current in terms of what's happening in the economy. So they're doing more things online. They still need to develop their skills. They still need to understand that it's really a global economy. They're not just competing with whoever is next door down the street. And that requires a change of mindset and coming up with different ideas. And so that's something that we approach in our training experience with our clients to really help them to begin to think differently about what does it mean to be an entrepreneur, because for most women, and particularly minority women, this is the first time they're venturing out as an entrepreneur, and they don't know successful entrepreneurs. So they don't have people who they can call and sort of just brainstorm about this and that, who can give them good guidance, because they don't know anybody else who's done that. And what they usually get back is feedback from people who are employees. They may be very good employees, but they want to stay employees.
Right.
And the mindset of an employee and the mindset of an entrepreneur are not the same. And so they need to really understand that difference and create a network of successful business people who they can share ideas and experiences with so that they can become stronger entrepreneurs. And that takes time, and it's a challenge because within our community there's so few highly successful entrepreneurs.
Could we just for like 1 second, and not to do a disservice to the venture fund or to anyone who's starting their business, but if someone is sort of in the infancy of their business, what sort of would you guide them to do? Is a city contract the holy grail, or what sort of milestone would you urge them toward now?
So first of all, because our name can sometimes be confusing, we're actually a loan fund, not a venture capital fund. So we work with businesses from the startup stage all the way to when they're growing.
Right.
And
when it's a blessing and a curse to get that city contract, and you gotta expand.
Exactly. And then when cash flow is really a big issue.
You negotiate the terms.
Right.
Exactly. Right. Try that with the city. So the idea of having women really understand how to think about entrepreneurship differently is important because the economy has changed, and that changes every so often. So even if you were good in 2008,
New deal.
Yeah.
it's a new place, it's a new world.
Now, I read the statistic that said that of the 91% of women-owned businesses, if only a quarter of those businesses were to add just one employee, then we would create 100,000 jobs in New York City. What are the simple sort of tasks that a company can do to just expand their business by 2 or 3 employees?
And can I piggyback off that and ask what a larger company could do to help that company do what Aaron said, to fulfill them being able to hire one person?
Well, let me address that point first. There are mentor programs that exist with several city agencies and state agencies wherein large established firms take on smaller, oftentimes MWBE firms as their mentees.
Gotcha.
And they actually can partner with them on contracts, in particular, government contracts, and help them through the process so they get support in seeing how things typically should be done. So any company out there, whether it's a private sector deal or a public sector deal, could benefit from, not only taking on a mentee, which could be a smaller firm, but also breaking up some of the bigger contracts that are typically awarded.
To follow up though with that,
Sure.
how do we sort of make sure that that doesn't get abused, whereas the woman-owned business sort of becomes just window dressing?
Yeah.
Well, there have been several lawsuits.
Where it's like, oh, we got a black firm, give us the contract.
Yeah, of course. There's a syndrome called men in skirts, where effectively there are, what appears to be a female-owned firm where it's fronted by, a woman whose husband or spouse or friend or what have you is actually the operating base behind it. So, there is a higher level of scrutiny that exists now in the public sector in identifying those areas. What we can do as, general public is promote good practices and provide support to small companies that are doing it the right way. Doing it legitimately. As you were talking about technical assistance, there are tons of organizations out there that can provide technical assistance, but as business owners, you've got to do your research. You've got to scour the web. You have to form networks. Talk to people that are out there doing it every day and can give you some good recommendations. So at the end of the day, there's a role that can be played by the large firms out there that can reach back and to help support the community growth. Because as you were saying, if these companies can hire 1, 2, 3 people, it leads to a system of economic growth in our communities, and that leads to community revitalization. Women and minority-owned businesses tend to hire other women and other minorities at rates higher than a majority-owned business. So if you can create this ecosystem in our communities where we support minority women-owned businesses when we shop, if we are in a position in a government agency or can influence, policy to be able to say to our elected officials, we want more utilization of women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses. Everybody in the general public can have a hand in doing that by contacting their local elected official. If you don't know who your elected official is, pick up the phone, call 311 and find out, and call them and say, what can you do or what are you doing to support women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses?
We all have the power to.
We can all help.
We can all with your dollars,
That's
as
right.
always.
That's
The
right.
amplifying effect is particularly strong with women and minority-owned business.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask you, Maria, what makes a strong applicant? When something crosses your desk, what really helps to put them over the edge, and how can people sort of acquire the skills to stand out?
Yes, I'll answer your question and piggyback on what she was saying, is because it's one and the same, really. An entrepreneur has to have a network. I think that's really part of the reality, that their world needs to consist of people who they can call on for information, for introductions, for brainstorming, for guidance. But at the end of the day, the entrepreneur has to have the ability to see where they're going and to have the strength, because it takes an emotional courage to go beyond what you're used to actually do something. And if you're not doing something different from what your competitors are doing, the chances of you succeeding in a significant way have been diminished. So too many times we see people who are simply doing exactly the same thing that they see their neighbor in the business doing, or they heard about, or they read about, or whatever. And all they think they have to do is follow that recipe that they think they understand, and that will lead to success. And it won't, because they don't understand what were the nuances that went along the journey for that particular entrepreneur.
See the finish
And
result.
it changes too.
Exactly. So I think that at the end of the day, most entrepreneurs have tenacity, and they have persistence as a quality, but they don't always have creativity. And I think that instead of trying to do things that is not in your sort of wheelhouse, you need to find other people to partner with to help fill in the gaps where you're weak. And I think the best thing that an entrepreneur can do is to acknowledge where they're weak and have people that they can call upon. So when somebody comes to us as an applicant, and they, first of all, a red flag goes up when we ask them who's their customer, and they say everybody. So we already know that one business is not going to get a very big loan. And then we ask them how much of a loan do they want, and they say, well, how much do you make? How much will you give? And that's a second big flag. So really, we're looking for people who understand what they're doing today and how they're going to get to where they envision getting to tomorrow. And sometimes it's not clear, and that's okay. We can help them sort of sort through some of their options. We can sometimes point out options. We can help them sort of see weaknesses in their foundation that if they strengthen, they could actually get to where they're going or get beyond where they thought they can get to. And so those are the things that we're looking for. One is honesty. Second is, what's the track record? So they've got to have done something that gives us an indication of their capacity. And then third is, how clear are they about what they want to do and where their strengths and weaknesses lie? And if we feel confident in those answers and feel that that relationship is something that we can continue to nurture to go forward, then we're likely to make a partner relationship with them, because every loan that we make is non-standard. It's really based on that business and their milestones. And so if we're going to invest the time that it takes to create something unique, we really want to get to know you, and we want to know that what you're telling us is going to really pan out because you're being honest.
Well, that's news you can definitely use.
And before we go, I do want to just shout out the fact that Brooklyn is leading the charge.
Well, and we hope to be a partner in all of those ventures moving forward. So get in touch with us. We want to be in your network. Thank
Sabrina,
you both for
Maria,
coming.
thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
Thank you, thank you,
Thank
thank you.
Curated.